do you work out? Like genuinely, pause this video and think about that question. I think so many times we don't actually think about why we work out. You might say, oh, I want to lose 20 pounds. Or maybe you want to get a six-pack. Or maybe you just want to put on some muscle mass. But why? Why do you want to lose 20 pounds? Why do you want to get a six-pack? Why do you even want to put on some pounds of muscle in the first place? Is it to look better? Is it to get a better sexual attraction? Is it to cover up your insecurities and self-doubt? See, the thing is, so many times we either don't have a strong enough why, or we don't even have an underlying motive as to why we work out, especially one that honors God. Especially as Christians, fitness can feel complicated, especially with the rise of technology and desk jobs. On one end, we can completely ignore the body, not even engaging in exercise at all. And on the other end, especially with the rise of social media, we can also fall into the trap of glorifying the body, placing our identity in whether or not we have a visible six-pack. And neither of these extremes are good. One is neglect, and the other one is worship. And both of them miss what the body is actually for. Because Scripture doesn't tell us to ignore the body, but it also doesn't tell us to obsess over it either. In this video, I'm gonna break down why we, as Christians, should consider working out. Not as vanity, not as obsession. I'm going to walk you through how fitness supports our joy, our will, love, and God. And dive into practically how those play out through losing fat, building muscle, and getting and staying in shape. Then I'll give you access to an entire worksheet on some helpful, more powerful motives for working out, in addition to several questions and prayer prompts to actually think about and meditate on when crafting your why. By the end of this video, you will have a clear blueprint as to how exercise actually supports the Christian life and how it can be an essential tool in our sanctification journey. In this video, like I said, I'm going to be going over why should Christians be fit, and I'll be laying out a biblical and scientific case for building muscle, losing fat, and ultimately maintaining a healthy body composition. Right? So what does it look like for us to get and stay in shape, and why? That's the key question here. Why should we do that? So I'm going to go into 4 components here. One, for your mind. Number 2, for your will. Number 3, for your love. And lastly, for God. It's a big topic, and I know I won't be able to get into all the nitty-gritty details, or maybe even some things that I might leave out of this video just for time's sake. But I'm going to be doing as best as I can to get a full comprehensive approach as to kind of these 4 overarching reasons of why Christians should be fit. So number 1, for your mind. So fitness removes our biological barriers to delight. Right? So number 1, biological foundations of joy. God designed our brain to function in specific ways, right? Our bodies are curated, they're created in a certain way such that certain neurons fire in a certain way, or certain organs operate and function the way they do. So let's kind of look into how fitness can help just fuel those biological foundations of joy. So first off, exercise helps increase BDNF, and this is your brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And you can think of this just kind of like miracle grow, right? When you put it on the soil, it just tenders the soil so it's perfect for growing plants. In the same way, this is kind of like the growth factor, so to speak, for your neurons, right? And this is really helpful for brain plasticity, long-term memory, survival of nerve cells. So just think of this, just BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, like one of the best, fuels to be able to have a sharp and clear mind, right? So how does this impact your normal life? Like I said, neuroplasticity, you'll have better learning, better emotional regulation, and better stress resilience. So ultimately, BDNF helps your brain adapt, grow, and regulate your mood, okay? So without fitness, without exercise, you're gonna have lower activity levels, and because of that, you're gonna have lower brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and as a result, reduced mental fortitude, reduced mental clarity. Your brain's not going to be as sharp and ready to go to accomplish many of your different daily tasks. Next up is dopamine sensitivity. So dopamine is your reward molecule. Whenever you do something maybe challenging or something that gives you pleasure, you'll release a lot of dopamine. Okay, so this is involved with your motivation, pleasure, and this basically says repeat beneficial behaviors, and it gives you satisfaction upon completion. So when we do things like watch explicit videos or go on social media for a long time, watch pornography, or just eat a bunch of junk food, those are things, high stimulus activities, that will spike our dopamine, okay? And those huge spikes and falls will ultimately lead to just terrible sensitivity of our dopamine levels in the long run, okay? So when we think about exercise helps restore our dopamine sensitivity, okay? And so what does this mean? This means that we enjoy our simple things more that were meant to give us enough dopamine in the first place. And because of that, we experience deeper satisfaction, less dependence on artificial stimulations, and ultimately we can restore our original reward system. So for example, when we consistently do things like social media, right, it takes little to no effort to just swipe on your phone for hours and hours and hours and watch videos that will give you just a flood of dopamine, a flood of pleasure, satisfaction for little to no effort, right? So because of that, because the way that we're created, that basically just makes us think that, okay, we can put into no effort at all into a certain action and get a super high reward, in a sense, out of it. And that constant just low expectation over time really screws up our dopamine sensitivities, right? So with exercise, as you probably know, and I'll get into a little bit more in this video, is it takes time, right? It takes time to build muscle. It takes time to lose fat. It takes time to really just get into good shape and stay that way, right? So through that process, which I'll get into more, that will help us restore our dopamine sensitivity, okay? So thinking about things like Psalm 16:11, there's joy in God's presence. Romans 15:13, Psalm 32:11, and John 15:11. We are meant to experience joy in this Christian life. Like, there is a fullness of joy at God's right hand, pleasures forevermore, right? So when we do things like get a lot of junk food in, constant social media, pornography, just constant novelty in these artificial things, we can really screw up our dopamine, right? So we can't really experience the fullness of joy with a hijacked reward system, right? So going back to removing the biological foundations that get in the way of just natural biological joy, fitness and exercise really helps accomplish that. On a similar note, serotonin and mood stability. So serotonin is a neurotransmitter and a hormone involved with your mood, anxiety, emotional reactivity, your sleep, impulse control, and even just your overall sense of well-being, or even just happiness in a general sense. And what happens when you have poor serotonin levels is you get more irritable, you have increased anxiety, you have greater mood swings, and you tend to dwell more on the negative things, and you're just more impulsive throughout the day, okay? And when you exercise, especially when you lift weights or go on a run, you're going to increase your serotonin levels, okay? And not only do you increase your serotonin levels in and of itself, but you also improve your receptor sensitivity. So what does this mean? This means that your brain becomes even more responsive to the serotonin that you already have, okay? So exercise essentially acts as almost like a natural antidepressant, because not only does it increase your serotonin, that gives you better sleep, less anxiety, more stable mood, but it also improves the effectiveness of the ones that you already have, okay? So Philippians 4:4 says, rejoice in the Lord always, right? And I just want to be clear, like, exercise is not the ultimate source of joy, the foundation of our identity, the replacement of the Holy Spirit. But what exercise does do is that it supports the vessel through which those spiritual fruits are expressed. So through exercising, we can become less reactive, less impulsive, less volatile, especially because of optimizing our serotonin levels and dopamine levels, etc. So in that sense, exercise can help us be more capable of patience, self-control, gratitude, and joy. Next up, exercise ultimately helps us with decreased inflammation. So whenever you have an excess amount of body fat, you have what's called inflammatory cytokines, okay? And these just basically inflame your body, and you'll have chronic inflammation. And what happens when you're chronically inflamed is that you're gonna have more depression, more fatigue, a ton of brain fog in general, and just ultimately cognitive dullness, right? You won't be able to think sharp or be very clear in your thoughts, your brain, etc. So how does this kind of play out? So first off, maybe you're eating too much over a long period of time, so as a result you put on a lot of body fat. What does that lead to? That leads to chronic inflammation. So now your body is really inflamed, not in an ideal state that it should be in, that your body was ultimately created to operate in. And then that ultimately leads to brain fog, and then that leads to frustration, burnout, less self-control, and then that leads to you being just tired, very fatigued in general, and then that affects so many other areas of your life, like your marriage, your kids, your workplace, even just having enough motivation or clarity for just fun activities in general. So as you can see, just having an excess amount of body fat can really impact so many areas of your life simply just because of that increased inflammation. So what an excess amount of body fat also does is it puts you in your sympathetic nervous system, and this just basically makes you in a fight or flight response constantly. So if you think about it, we have our parasympathetic nervous system and our sympathetic nervous system. So the parasympathetic nervous system is basically when we're calm, we know we have food, we're in a calm, chill state, right? And on the other end of the spectrum, your sympathetic nervous system is when you're all amped up, like your flight or fight response, like a tiger or a lion's running after you and you need to escape. It's like a survival mode, right? And as I'm sure you would expect, it's not ideal for us to constantly be in a state of like anxiety or worry about something possibly bad happening to us, right? And that's exactly what having a ton of body fat does, is it puts us in that heightened state of awareness, not in a good way, but in such that we are not able to operate as efficiently and well as we could have if we're not inflamed. One way I like to explain this is looking through a dirty window versus a clean window. Right? So with the dirty window, let's say there's a big storm that happened outside, it's super dirty, your window has a ton of mud on it, and it's very hard to see outside. You might have to strain to look around the little dirt spots, and ultimately you might still be able to see outside a little bit, but it's definitely really, really foggy, and you have to really strain to see what's on the other side of that window, right? Think of this like having a ton of excess body fat. You're chronically inflamed, it's hard to think straight, it's hard to think clearly, it's hard to operate efficiently, and this is kind of like the dirty window. Whereas on the other side of the spectrum, a clean window, you just look out the window and you don't really have to strain to look out, you just kind of see what's on the other side. Well, in the same way, having less body fat is one easy way to clean up your window, so to speak, so you don't have to put in more effort for the same outcome of simply looking out on the other side, right? And this influences so many things in our lives, like our prayer focus, our Bible engagement, your patience with others, especially your wife and or kids, your discernment on especially hard decisions to make, and then gratitude as well, right? If it's harder for us, if we have more brain fog, more fatigue, it's going to be harder to focus during prayer, right? If we're more irritable, we're going to be more emotional with our kids. It's going to be harder to be a peaceful example and lead our household like we're called to do if we're constantly having these mood swings and not very clear with our brains. So that's kind of just an overall kind of explanation of how God designed our brain to function in certain ways and how exercise can kind of relate to increasing our BDNF, our dopamine sensitivity, our serotonin and mood, and ultimately decreasing inflammation through losing fat and exercising and maintaining a healthy body composition. Next up is energy, vitality, and daily delight. So God designed the body to function in specific ways, right? So first up, sleep. When you exercise, you have improved sleep. Okay, not only just improved sleep, but just everything about sleep in general. So sleep onset, meaning you'll be able to go to bed quicker and more effectively. Number 2, sleep depth, you'll get even deeper sleep. And number 3, sleep efficiency. You won't be waking up in the middle of the night. You'll be able to sleep for a longer period of time and just be more efficient with the time that you go to bed until you wake up. And one note here is to not exercise too close to bedtime, because you don't want to be spiking your heart rate too close to bed. That'll not really help you with sleep. But in general, exercising during the day will really improve so many different factors of your sleep. Okay, and the reason why sleep is so important is because of your emotional regulation. This is one huge thing of sleep, is that deep sleep strengthens your prefrontal cortex, which is involved with decision making, and then it also reduces your amygdala overreaction, so your emotional volatility or big mood swings, okay? So when you have your sleep locked in, when you have ideal sleep, getting 8 hours per night, you're gonna have less snapping at your wife, you're gonna have more patience with your kids, and ultimately less irritation at small inconveniences, right? So kind of on the other end, okay, what happens when we don't get enough sleep? Well, poor sleep often leads to increased cortisol, which is your stress hormone, increased irritability, decreased testosterone levels. You're going to have more cravings and greater emotional reactivity, okay? So just kind of an overarching umbrella of that is just a ton of irritability and lack of self-control. So what are some practical examples of this? Well, you're going to have shorter temper in traffic. You're going to have a lower stress tolerance at work. You're going to have less motivation to train in general. You're going to have less discipline with choosing healthier foods. And you're ultimately going to have a less desire to engage in the spiritual disciplines, right? So what does poor sleep do is it ultimately makes obedience feel way harder than it needs to be, right? By being, on top of your exercising on a consistent basis, you can lead yourself naturally and biologically to better sleep, right? You don't even have to have ideal sleep patterns or like sleep habits right before you go to bed. Simply through exercising, you can make obedience easier than it needs to be if your sleep is not getting optimized. So what else negatively affects sleep? Well, once again, higher body fat levels. So when you have a greater amount of body fat, you're going to have increased risk of sleep apnea. You're going to have less deep restorative sleep. You're going to have a ton of messed up hormones like your leptin, ghrelin, cortisol, and testosterone. And that's going to affect so many different areas of your life simply due to that lack of sleep or simply due to that negatively impacting your sleep. So let me highlight a couple there. First of all is low testosterone. And as a result of that, you're going to have lower drive in general. So how does this play out in general? Means you're less motivated, less confident, less assertive. You're less inclined to pursue hard things, right? You don't have as much motivation or a kickstart to really get the ball rolling. And what does this affect in your daily life? Well, it affects your leadership in your household, your initiative in your marriage, your spiritual discipline, and your calling in general, right? So ultimately, by not exercising, you can increase your body fat levels, or even just having a high body fat level in general will then negatively impact your sleep, which then negatively impacts your testosterone levels. Next up is just messed up hormones, right? And especially leptin and ghrelin, which is your satiety and hunger hormones, okay? And that'll ultimately lead to more cravings. So when you have jacked up sleep, your food cravings rise, your emotional eating increases, and your dopamine sensitivity is negatively affected, okay? So that ultimately leads to more junk food, more screen time, social media, binge watching shows, and more ways of just finding escapes, small escapes that'll get you away from reality, right? Just a domination, a marking of small pleasures that don't really take much effort to do, right? And what does this lead to? Well, prayer feels harder, scripture feels less engaging, and hard conversations just feel absolutely exhausting. And it's not because you don't love God, but it's because your body, and it's not because you don't love God, but ultimately because your body and hormones are dysregulated, right? So with optimized sleep, your work feels engaging, your workouts feel powerful, conversations are more enjoyable, worship feels emotionally present instead of draining, and you're just able to laugh more easily, right? And on the other hand, with poor sleep, everything feels dull, you feel behind all day, there's minor stressors in your life and they feel major, and joy just kind of feels distant, right? So at the end of the day, better sleep can lead to better mood in general, which ultimately leads to better relational joy. So at the end of the day, better sleep through exercise and nightly habits and decreasing your body fat levels allows you to better embody James 1:19, which ultimately encourages us to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. So simply by optimizing our sleep through exercise, nightly habits, and decreasing body fat levels, we can better embody that lesson. Next up is stabilized blood sugar. So our brain, its primary source of fuel, so to speak, is glucose. And just think about glucose just kind of like carbs in general, sugars, stuff like that. So when your brain has a steady supply of glucose, your energy is steady, your mood is steady, your focus is more sharp, your cravings are more manageable, and ultimately at the end of the day, your stress tolerance is much higher. You don't have those big mood swings. You're not affected as much by little things that could irritate you. And on the other hand, when your glucose levels or blood sugar levels spike and crash, you're going to be wired at the top, at the high of the highs, and then you're going to be exhausted at the bottom, right? And also at the crash as well, you're going to be more irritable, you're going to have greater anxiety, your cravings are going to spike even more, and your motivation drops. So let's kind of look at how blood sugar actually kind of practically plays out through eating a cinnamon roll and some oatmeal. So let's say you have a cinnamon roll. Right after you have that, your blood sugar is just going to spike really quickly. Why? Well, because a cinnamon roll is very high in carbs, very high in sugars, really fast digesting sugars, and you're going to get a huge spike, and then very shortly after, you're going to get a huge crash way lower than baseline. On the other hand, if you have, so to say, a bowl of oatmeal, not as much sugar, a lot less carbs, and more longer releasing carbs, your blood sugar level is going to be more stable, right? It's going to rise and fall, but it's going to be in that ideal range where you're able to function optimally, right? So big spikes are going to affect your patience, your self-control, initiative, joy, and so much more. Because let's say, okay, you have the cinnamon roll, your blood sugar spikes and then goes down, and then at this bottom right here, you're gonna even want more food, because why? You feel so tired, so depleted right here. So what happens? Your craving spike, your hunger spikes. You're just gonna continually feed this negative loop, and you're just gonna continually have these rise and falls, which is gonna ultimately affect your self-control, joy, initiative, and patience even more so than it already is. So now that we know kind of how blood sugar works, kind of our brain's main fuel source of glucose, why does that matter, and how does that play into exercise, losing fat, maintaining a healthy body composition? Well, here's kind of three main ways of how each of those things improve our blood sugar stability. So number one is resistance training. So this is just basically working out in the gym. Think about it as just building muscle over time. So as you build muscle, it provides a high capacity storage site for glucose, okay? So let's say you go to the gym, you start lifting some weights, and then you ultimately have more muscle mass, you start seeing results. Well, think of your muscle almost like a little storage bin, a little bit of space for carbs, and because of that, your body doesn't have to have these big spikes and falls, but it's a lower spike, right? It's a more ideal thing. So for example, let's say you have that cinnamon roll, but maybe you have a lot more muscle. This rise and fall won't be as exaggerated, okay? That's resistance training. Here's fat loss. So like I mentioned earlier, excess fat leads to chronic inflammation, insulin resistance, elevated fasting insulin, and way higher cortisol, okay? So as a result of losing that fat, not only do you get improved insulin sensitivity, so that just basically means you won't have as high of spikes and falls, but you'll have decreased inflammation, which helps with brain fog, fatigue, and so many other things. But you'll also have improved cortisol regulation, that's your stress hormone, less blood sugar fluctuations, so you'll just be more on that more ideal level of operation if you simply just lose fat. And through losing fat, your body is just much more efficient and capable of dispersing their proper nutrients to their proper places. So by having a lot of fat, your body is a lot less efficient at being able to use certain nutrients and being able to do certain processes that help us function optimally. And lastly, cardio or aerobic exercise, things like running, walking, Stairmaster, stuff like that, even playing sports. This will increase your insulin sensitivity and improve your glucose oxidation, which ultimately means, again, you'll have more stable energy levels throughout the day. You won't have these bigger spikes or falls. And one of the beauties of, let's say, cardio, or even just working out in general, is after you work out, your body is going to be able to use those nutrients way more effectively rather than if you're just kind of sitting at your desk all day. So think about it like this. If you have a hard workout or go on a run, your muscles disperse those or use up those glycogen levels, and your brain uses a ton of glucose, and then your body's kind of depleted of these nutrients. So after working out, they're hungry in a sense. They're ready to take all these back in to be able to store and use and recover for later. So simply going for a walk, run, or exercising after a meal that's super high in sugar, a high glycemic meal, that can really help your body actually use that fuel for something instead of just storing it around or even converting it to body fat later on. So what are some consequences of unstable blood sugar levels? Well, you're going to have greater brain fog, shorter temper, lower energy midday, a lot more late night cravings,
and just greater emotional reactivity. Okay, so this leads to it being harder to be patient, easier to snap over especially really small things, easier to fall into comfort eating and gluttony. It's way harder to focus in prayer, and it's harder to pursue difficult things and disciplines throughout your day, right? And as Christians, we're called to self-control, gentleness, steadfastness, leadership, and sacrificial love, right? So blood sugar instability makes those way harder biologically, not impossible, but much harder, right? Think about the dirty window versus the clean window. It's still possible, but it's way harder. And if we want to embody, self-control, gentleness, steadfastness, leadership, sacrificial love, we want to make it as easy as possible for us to actually live out those things, right? And one simple way is through optimizing our blood sugar levels through resistance training, fat loss, and cardio or aerobic exercise. Next up is your fitness ultimately removes unnecessary suffering. And through working out, losing fat, building muscle, you're honoring the vessel by eliminating preventable, and that's the key word, preventable pain and hindrance. Hebrews 12:1 explains how, therefore, since we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And when I think of our current society right now, I think of 4 huge things, especially that are preventable or fixable matters that hinder our health greatly. So number 1 is gluttony, just a consistent overconsumption or consistent falling into eating more than we need or very unhealthy foods, think of like desserts, bad fast food choices, and a consistent measure of that over time. Number 2, laziness and slothfulness. And number 3, a lack of self-control. And lastly, poor sleep. And when these things consistently happen over time, there's so many negative impacts that can happen in our lives that are a result of that. So through gluttony, laziness, lack of self-control, poor sleep, we are likely going to have both an increase of fat levels, and we're going to have less activity throughout the day, less muscle mass, and all of those things lead to these 6 huge issues that could happen later down the line, especially if these compound over time and we don't really engage in physical fitness at all. So the first one is joint decay or osteoarthritis, and then respiratory strain or sleep apnea, where basically you're not able to breathe during your sleep, and that leads to really no oxygen being able to get to your brain. And like I said earlier, chronic inflammation, which can lead to cancer, cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, and Alzheimer's disease. Not enough exercise or falling into gluttony, laziness, self-control, poor sleep can also lead to type 2 diabetes, which will lead to heart disease, vision loss, and kidney disease. And then also hypertension, where you're more likely to have stroke, heart attack, or kidney disease. And then lastly, you're going to have a ton of heart problems, heart attacks, strokes, etc. And the main 3 things that these lead to are financial burdens, death, and burden and stressed loved ones, right? And the thing with all of these is that they're ultimately preventable in the sense of there's things that we can do right now today with our bodies, with our exercise, that can prevent a greater likelihood of these happening, right? So sometimes, yes, you're going to have a random heart attack, or you might get some chronic inflammation from something, or you might have a stroke out of the blue. But at the end of the day, when we have a lack of self-control, poor sleep, laziness, gluttony, and we start putting on body fat and we don't have much activity, these things become a greater likelihood of actually happening, right? So at the end of the day, there's kind of 2 types of suffering, right? There's one that God ordains and that sanctifies us through that process and ultimately deepens our faith, right? And there's also suffering that comes ultimately from a sedentary lifestyle, a poor diet, sleep neglect, and metabolic dysfunction. And these are all things that we can actually, through discipline, affect and change right now in the present. And at the end of the day, fitness helps us remove unnecessary suffering. And let me keyword unnecessary, things that we can ultimately prevent through our current actions today caused by our own neglect. But it does not guarantee control over our life, nor does it replace our dependence on Christ. So even if you do have an active lifestyle, a good diet, your sleep's on point, there is a chance that some of these things could still happen, right? But at the end of the day, we make it a less likelihood over things that we can ultimately control through our daily actions and daily disciplines of physical fitness. So that was just an overview of how fitness, losing body fat, gaining muscle can help our mind and ultimately remove biological barriers to joy and our delight. And the next reason as to why we should work out is for your will. At the end of the day, fitness trains the power to choose obedience. So first up is discipline. When you lose fat or gain muscle, you're always going to have choices, right? This happens with everything in your life. When you want to achieve a certain goal, you have the choice to either do something that will move you towards that goal or do something that will move you away from that goal. And one thing with fat loss and muscle gain is calorie control and craving management. So for fat loss, you need to eat less than you burn on a consistent basis, right? And pair that with consistent resistance training as well as enough protein. So some common things that you will have to do through the fat loss process is you're going to have to resist some hyper-palatable foods. You're going to have to manage your cravings. You can't just emotionally eat all the time. That will make you fall off track. You're going to have to not give in to late night impulses. You're going to have to engage in the discipline of tracking your calories. You'll probably have to plan for big meals so you can fit it in your calorie budget, and you'll ultimately have to figure out how to get in enough protein, right? So consistently over time, you're going to be training your self-control, discipline, and delayed gratification through that process of fat loss, right? So these same kind of muscles, so to speak, of self-control, discipline, and delayed gratification that you build through the process of fat loss helps us in our sanctification, in our fight against lust, anger restraint, financial disciplines, and time management, right? So there's so many different things that the simple process of fat loss can help us with. And same thing too with muscle gain. Some things that are required for gaining muscle, or things that you'll have to engage with, is showing up repeatedly, right? Like I mentioned earlier, it takes a long time of consistent effort to actually put on muscle mass. You'll have to stick to a plan and structure. You'll have to progressively overload or add some small increases over time. And you'll have to trust that long-term process. You're gonna have to eat to fuel rather than just kind of feel good or just comfort eating. And you're gonna need to have patience to actually see results. And similar to fat loss is that muscle gain, that process of building muscle over time, trains us in our patience, delayed gratification, and our consistency. So what does this help us do? It helps kill the flesh. It helps us get uncomfortable, and it helps us say yes to hard things that we don't want to do, and ultimately patience with hard work, right? So simply through the act of building muscle is you can literally have more patience. You can train that muscle over time. You can have delayed gratification, so you can say no to something that will give you more pleasure now, but ultimately say yes to a thing that will give you even more pleasure in the long run. So at the end of the day, fitness teaches our will to put greater importance on greater long-term rewards rather than lesser short-term pleasures. So through the process of losing fat and gaining muscle, we can be more equipped with the skill of discipline. Next up is exercise helps us kill the flesh, right? And if you think about the flesh loves comfort, indulgence, and instant gratification. It's always looking for the easiest path to something, the path with little to no effort, the least amount of resistance. So think of things like overeating, laziness, giving into urges, and escaping discomfort. And some ways that the flesh kind of plays itself out through fitness is late night junk food, emotional eating, giving into cravings, comfort eating, and constant snacking. Just, I'm hungry, let me eat, let me fill that urge. And some life examples of how the flesh plays out is through our lust, anger, laziness, and addiction, right? So one thing that exercise is super helpful with is exposing the flesh, right? When you're in the gym, you can expose your pride. You can expose your vanity, comparison, impatience, laziness. And ultimately the gym can serve as a mirror for our hearts. It can really reveal these things that we may be struggling with, whereas if we maybe didn't engage with exercise, we wouldn't even really know that we're struggling with vanity or comparison or pride as much as we really are. So at the end of the day, fitness will never directly kill the flesh because we are empowered by the Spirit to put to death the deeds of the flesh, but it serves as a great tool to help us uncover and expose the flesh. Next up is transformed, not conformed. So in our society and just through life in general, we typically see that when you put in work or put in exertion, there's ultimately going to be a reward on the other end. This reward might be right after finishing that work, or even during the work, or sometimes it might be years or even decades down in the future. And we kind of have this common sense of that oftentimes greater joy is on the other side of greater work, right? You work hard to do something, there's probably going to be a greater reward, whereas maybe you didn't even work hard or even at all for something, it's going to be a lesser reward. And this kind of connotes laziness and how it may feel good for a moment, but it's ultimately not satisfying in the end, right? That's why when you have a piece of candy, you don't just stop at one candy, right? One piece is not satisfying. You have to keep on feeding that more and more, because one piece will not satisfy you in the end. And exercise sustains and improves our work ethic in that it reminds us and ingrains us in the system that our hard work produces results, right? So if you think about it, when you start working out and you start, following a plan, eating less calories, eating more protein, resistance training in the gym, you ultimately see results. And then after you see results, you repeat the process, right? So hard work leads to results, which then leads to you repeating the process. Why? Because you saw that hard work actually paid off. And the problem is that in today's society, we're conditioned by things that make us expect comfort and encourage us to calculate easiest means rather than best outcomes. So easiest means of like, what's the easiest thing for me to do right now? What's the path of least resistance versus, okay, what's going to lead to the best end result? It might require a little bit more effort, but ultimately, what's going to be the best outcome in the end? And without intentionality, we will be shaped by our flesh's path of least resistance rather than the Spirit's call to bear fruit, right? If we just kind of never engage with discipline at all or rely on the Spirit, we're just going to be given into our flesh, right? And ways that this plays out is through social media, binge watching shows, unintentional eating and gluttony, avoiding hard conversations in your daily life, and then also just numbing out with alcohol or other substances. And exercise teaches and reminds us that intentional effort leads to noticeable results. Let me say that again. Intentional effort leads to noticeable results, okay? So this happens with all of your choices, right? You're going to see that intentional effort leads to noticeable results, even with something like social media or binge watching shows, right? Your intentional effort, little to no effort at all, or just time effort in a sense of just scrolling social media or just watching shows, will lead to more negative noticeable results of maybe you feeling depleted afterwards or seeing that you wasted time. It'll lead to maybe some anxiety in the future. So there are noticeable results through everything, and exercise ultimately reminds us and really enforces the fact that greater effort produces even greater results. So through building muscle, we can see that kind of loop of, okay, hard work leads to good progress, and then on the other end of the spectrum, little to no work produces bad fruit, right? And in Scripture, we're called to be in this world, not of this world. And if you just think about general society, there's roughly 70% of U.S. adults that are overweight or obese. 10 to 15% of men and 2 to 5% of women are in optimal body fat ranges. And only 1 to 3% of people have visible abs. I think if I were to ask you, okay, like what's more common, having abs or not, a lot of people would maybe even say that having abs are more common. But if we just look at the stats, that it's such an abnormal stat or an abnormal thing to have visible abs. Like only 1 to 3% people is such a low amount of society. On top of that, only roughly 1 to 2% of adult men can actually bench 225, and only 25%, 1 in 4 Americans meet recommended activity guidelines. So in a world where everyone's basically unhealthy, being healthy is abnormal, right? And one easy way that we can be transformed, not conformed by this world, is through exercise, right? It's a great opportunity to not look like the world and ultimately show that we're called to a higher standard of stewardship of our bodies as Christians, right? So at the end of the day, be transformed, not conformed, by the renewing of your mind. Why? Through fitness, so you can look more like Christ. Next is leaning into the hill. So throughout our lives, we're going to experience different hills, right? Whether that be a small hill, like getting out of bed or starting a hard conversation, or maybe there's going to be greater hills, like being productive at work during a dry season, or even just starting a run and workout early in the morning, right? And whatever hill you might be facing, when we're walking uphill, it takes more effort to keep putting one foot in front of the other. Okay, so hills are inevitable in this life. Okay, we're gonna face troubles. In this world, we will have troubles. So there's two ways to kind of think about this as we're on the way up of a certain hill. So mindset number one is you stop or slow down, you decrease effort, and as a result, you spend more time going up the hill, right? So you're going up the hill, things get hard, you take back the effort, so you go a little bit slower. And as a result, spend more time going up in general. And then on the other hand, mindset number two is leaning into the pain and discomfort of going up that hill. It's pushing through the pain and ultimately expending more energy first to then get over the hill sooner and then enjoying the downslope, right? It's this mindset of leaning in. Like you expend more energy up front, but as a result, you get over the hill sooner and then you enjoy the downslope, right? Avoidance only makes the hill steeper the longer you wait. So with us, like I mentioned earlier, especially when we rely on the flesh, we often look for the path of least resistance. We typically avoid the hills we know we should be climbing each day, and we avoid what we know we should be doing because the hills that matter the most are often the ones that are hardest to climb. So how does this all relate to exercise and fitness? Well, physical exercise helps us develop the mentality to actually lean in, to spur us to action, to avoid, stopping early or giving less effort when the times do get tough. And we ultimately, through fitness, learn to see hills not as obstacles, but as opportunities for fruitfulness and growth, which ultimately leads us into looking into the reward. So let's say you're going up a hill. On that upslope, you're going to have a lot of discomfort, right? But you know that at the end of the day, once you finally overcome the peak of the hill and are on the downslope, that's your reward, so to speak, right? It's easier on the way down versus the way up. And because of that, you have a delayed reward, right? And the beautiful thing about exercise and fitness and just the way God created our bodies is that changing your body composition takes time, right? But at the same time, you can still see results on that way up of getting a better body composition. So like you see things like lift now, you're going to get strength and muscle later on. Or you do cardio now, you're going to have greater endurance later. Or maybe you eat in a calorie deficit now, you're going to have fat loss in the future, right? So fitness often reminds us that reward is not often immediate, right? Like when you go and lift, you're maybe not like, oh my gosh, I'm literally going to gain so much muscle right now, right? It's putting a token into the machine to ultimately give you that output, that reward of greater muscle in the future. And especially with like something like fat loss, is so many people will do it for a week, not see too much reward and then quit, right? But through sticking to the process, through having a goal of fat loss and actually accomplishing that over time, you see that through the pain, there's going to be a reward at the end, right? So it reminds us that the reward is not often immediate, but that there is a reward at the end of the hill. So let's take, for example, someone trying to practice the habit of running, okay? So a beginner runner, they're going to have greater discomfort. They're going to have little to no results yet because they're literally just starting. They're not going to have a great desire to go. They kind of see no point in running. And lastly, they don't really know about the reward at the end, right? They don't really know or see the benefits of running in the first place, right? I know a lot of people that are just like, okay, I'm not a runner. Right? I hate running. Running's not for me, yada, yada, yada. But on the other hand, I've also seen people who say that and then they actually engage with the discipline of running and then they become a full-on runner, okay? Which kind of leads me into the advanced runner. They've actually seen progress and results. They've seen greater endurance, less discomfort through those runs. Why? Because of practice and discipline. And because of that, they start the run because of the reward, right? I think about myself, every time I run, or I'd say 90% of the times I actually start a run, I'm not really looking forward to it. But I will say with 100% certainty that I've never regretted going on a run. Let me say that again. I will never really look forward to going on the run, but because I know that I will never regret it, that reward at the end of the hill, I will lean in and look to the reward on that resistance on the way up. So what does this little analogy teach us about the beginner versus more advanced runner? Well, it teaches us that discomfort has a purpose, right? And that discomfort, greater effort, often leads to change. That it hasn't disappeared, but it now has meaning, right? If we are going up a hill that we know is never going to end, why would we continue to go up the hill? There's not as much encouragement to actually do that. On the other end, if we look to the reward, if we lean in now, we know that this discomfort here has more purpose. It has meaning. Why? Because we get that reward in the end. James 1:2-3 says, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds." Why? Because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Right? And exercise ultimately teaches us perseverance, patience, and that pain has a purpose. 3 lessons that will take us a long way if we actually put them to practice. So let's do a little thought experiment. If I said, whatever your name is, I want you to do something that spiked your cortisol levels, made you really stressful, it elevates your heart rate even to uncomfortable or even dangerous levels, it makes you weaker, it makes you tired, it suppresses your immune system, and it increases your inflammation. Would you do it? I mean, the obvious question is probably not, right? But what if I said that this is exactly what resistance training does in the short run? In the short run, it does all these quote-unquote negative things, but ultimately leads to a long-term reward. See, exercise has short-term cost, but a long-term reward. So here, I'm going to go into several short little things that happen when we exercise, and ultimately, at the end of the day, when we do it for a longer period of time, or even just go throughout the day and recover, some rewards we start to see. So number 1 is cortisol spikes, your stress hormone surges when you work out, but at the end of the day, you'll have better hormonal regulation over time, and your baseline cortisol will drop. Elevated heart rate, your stress hormone surges, your body's pumping blood to your muscles, your heart is working harder, but at the end of the day, once you do that for a consistent period of time, you build that muscle, your heart is a muscle, and your heart becomes more efficient, and your heart pumps more blood per beat at rest. Increased inflammation in the short run, same process as injury, putting on muscle, tearing down those muscle fibers to be able to then build it back up greater later. It leads to systemic resilience, or your body ultimately becomes harder to break. Increased fatigue, your glycogen depletes, your mental fog kind of sets in. You might have experienced this during a workout. Maybe you didn't have much carbs before a workout, or didn't eat at all, did fasted cardio. You were just really tired, very brain fogged during or even after the workout. Well, the more you work out, you'll see that you have enhanced energy throughout your just regular day activities, increased mitochondria, more fuel throughout the day. And then lastly, a suppressed immune system. You have a temporary vulnerability window post-workout, and then through working out, you'll see a stronger immune baseline, and that repeated stress trains your immunity. So what does this all mean? Well, exercise teaches to taste joy even on the uphill, right? It might be hard now. There might be some hard things like discipline, having to engage with, spiking our cortisol, or getting tired, or doing something that we don't want to do, starting that run in the first place, that'll ultimately lead to joy and reward at the end of the day. So this teaches us and helps us with our sanctification, resisting temptation, enduring through trials because they have a purpose, and pursuing holiness in our lives. So that is why we should work out, for our will. And next up is why should we work out is for our love. So fitness increases our capacity to love and serve others. So in Scripture, Jesus summarized the law as loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. Pretty simple. And fitness matters because your body is the physical instrument through which you love. So there's a constant interplay between your spirit and your body. Kind of this dynamic throughout Scripture of how your spirit indwells within your body, and your body is actually a physical instrument through which you're able to operate and live through the Spirit. So ways that you love is all over your life. The ways that you love and serve others is through your marriage, your kids, just at your church in general, at your work, and throughout your community, whether that be through your kids' sports games, or even in a league yourself, at the gym, or even with your neighbors, right? There is so many opportunities to love and serve others in our daily lives. And if one of the main strivings of our life is to love God and love others, well, how do we effectively love others through our bodies? Well, one easy way is through exercise. So exercise helps us develop the capacity to serve. So if you think about it, energy is a ministry tool. right? Your energy with your spouse, patience with kids, less irritability, more presence and emotional stability can help you better lead or guide these people or serve them to a greater capacity. I'm going to kind of highlight 2 of these here. First off, energy and irritability. When you have poor sleep, as you can see, sleep is a common theme here, and you have high body fat, high inactivity, well, that leads to elevated cortisol or stress hormones, bigger blood sugar swings that we talked about earlier, chronic fatigue, mood volatility, and increased emotional reactivity. So what does this mean? It means that, okay, when your child disobeys, if you have poor sleep, high body fat, and inactivity, it's going to be harder to lead them in a more self-controlled manner, right? On the same end is you come home from work, you're going to be maybe less present with your wife or your spouse. You're going to be more stressed. You're going to be more moody when you get home instead of being present and peaceful and be able to lead her in a more effective manner. Plus, you're going to be less patient in conflict, right? You're going to have these big mood swings. You're going to have more fatigue, so you're not even going to want to engage or actually solve conflict in a healthy manner. You're even just going to avoid it or not even solve it in general. Ephesians 4:2 encourages us with be completely humble and gentle, be patient, bearing one another in love. And exercise enables our vessel, our body, through which we express these qualities, right? We're able to express humility, gentleness, patience, and love other people through our body and our energy levels. Next up is exercise helps us with the capacity to serve through more presence. So when you're fatigued, you withdraw, you scroll, you disengage, you become just mentally absent, you're just not there because you have just chronic fog, fatigue, etc. And when you're physically fit, you have better sleep, more stable blood sugar, improved cardiovascular health, and that really combats all of these factors of fatigue, right? And as a result, you become more alert, right? You come home from work, you're not as tired, you're not as spaced out or crushed by a work day. You're more energized, right? That's not to say that even if you are fit, you might still be tired sometimes, right? Just because you get better sleep, have less body fat levels, and more muscle, doesn't mean you're just invincible to physical fatigue. But at the end of the day, you make it easier for yourself to be more present, right? You're less likely to disengage. You're less likely to be mentally absent. And presence is a form of love, right? If you think about it, you come home, you see your kids and family, and you just go and scroll on social media or numb out, even through like a video game or just watching a show. You teach your kids that, okay, you don't matter as much to me as what I'm doing right now, right? And doing that over time will show them just a less sense of love. And Scripture teaches us in 1 Corinthians 13 that love is patient, right? And impatience often follows exhaustion. Right? If you think about it, when you're more tired, you're going to be more snappy, you're going to be more irritable, your mood's going to swing even higher, which is going to make it a lot harder to love with patience. And let me just get this very clear, is that fitness doesn't create love, it gives you a greater capability to express it, right? So going back to earlier of our biological foundations of just how we're made, well, we're made in such a way that through losing fat, through getting better sleep and maintaining a healthier body composition, we can have a greater capacity to be more present and love on others. Next up is longevity and loving for a longer time. So in Scripture, we're taught to live with eternity in mind. Like, think about the greatest vacation you've ever had. Leading up to that vacation, you were looking forward to it. You were making all these plans. You're getting your hotel, all the activities lined up. Who do you want coming with you? And then you're just looking forward to that amazing time. Well, in the same way, we're looking forward to eternal paradise, right? And because of that, we don't just want to love and serve well. We want to love and serve long, right? And then this doesn't mean, living to 100 plus. It just means, okay, how can we be as effective as we can with things that are ultimately in our control in terms of our discipline, our building muscle, and maximizing the seasons of our lives to put on muscle and lose fat when we can. So I'll kind of go into 2 different ones here with muscle and mortality. So first off, when you have low muscle mass, which is ultimately called like sarcopenia, especially like really, really low levels of muscle, that leads to increased mortality risk, frailty, falls, loss of independence, right? You won't be able to take care of yourself. And resistance training, or the act of going to the gym, training over time, putting on muscle, that will improve your bone density, you'll protect your joints, it'll improve your insulin sensitivity like we talked about earlier, and it'll reduce your risk of metabolic syndrome. So what does this mean? It means that you can play with your grandkids, right? You'll be more healthier for longer, and you'll not just be the grandpa that sits on the sidelines or is not even able to practice with your kids when they are, in little league or in baseball or soccer practice when they're young, right? So getting fit now, placing a priority on building muscle and resistance training can really help you later on, right? Looking to that reward of being able to play with your grandkids. Same thing goes with serving in your church and community. As we age, inevitably, we're going to start to lose muscle and we're going to become less capable. And through maximizing our younger seasons, or even this whatever season you're in right now, you can serve your church and community not only longer, but more effectively for longer, right? If you think about, a grandpa in his wheelchair when he's 60 years old, he can still serve the church and community. But let's say he was a grandpa, 60 years old, but he could still walk, jog, move around, lift heavy things. Well, that guy would probably, at least physically, be able to better serve the church or community. And same thing goes with preventable burden. Like, what a joy it is to be able to engage with discipline and work out now, such that later on we don't burden our family as much as we could, right? Like, at the end of the day, yes, age will take a toll on us. Death is guaranteed, but we could structure our lives in such a way that we maximize our current season that we're in right now so that we're not as much of a burden later on, or as much of a burden earlier on than we should be. Same thing goes with body fat, right? So when you have excess body fat, you have way greater disease risk, such as cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, which is just super high heart rate, erectile dysfunction, and cognitive decline. And if you think about it, all of these and just excess body fat in general also affect your intimacy in marriage, your stability in leadership, because that lack of mood swings or that greater sense of mood swings. You're going to have financial strain from all those medical costs of, maybe having these diseases, or maybe you have a heart attack. That's going to put a lot of financial and even emotional strain on your family to deal with those things that you ultimately probably could have prevented earlier on. That's not to say that these things won't happen, but ultimately taking initiative now while you can do something about it. You're going to have greater work burnout and inefficiency because of that brain fog, and also parenting fatigue. So as you can see, there's so many reasons as to why we should put on muscle and lose body fat and maintain a healthy body composition to ultimately love for a longer period of time. And lastly, fitness as witness. So our bodies oftentimes can be a window into our priorities and values, right? So if I were to say, hey, you have two options of working with a personal trainer. One of them is very fat, out of shape, and the other one is very fit, but they have the same knowledge. Which one are you going to go with? Well, you're probably going to go with the one that's more in shape. Why? Because what they say is actually played out and lived through their lives, right? There's greater trust there, right? So we as Christians, if we say we value self-control, if we say we value discipline, if we say we value love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, but our bodies maybe don't look like we do, then there could be a lack of trust there, right? And if we want to maximize our witness to a dying world, we want to make sure that we can do as much as we can to rely on the Spirit to help us live out and embody, both physically and spiritually, these different values, right? We're called to look different from the world, especially in our workplace, our family, our bodies, our peace and anxiety, right? When tragedy strikes, we can have peace in the sense that God works all things good for those who love Him, right? We can consider it pure joy when trials come. Why? Because they produce perseverance and steadfastness, right? We don't have to look like the world when something bad happens, because we know we have a good God who takes care of us. So exercise is just a super tangible way to look different from the world, and ultimately bring light to the wonder-working power of self-control, discipline, and stability that the Spirit empowers us to live by. So self-control is visible, discipline is visible, and those qualities build trust and intrigue to outsiders looking in, right? If I say I value self-control and discipline, yet I'm 400 pounds overweight, that doesn't really carry much weight, and that could spark some disingenuity of my statements. So lastly, why should we work out? This one is one of, if not the most important, but for God, right? Fitness is stewardship under Christ. So I'm going to go into kind of 4 different aspects of this. Of number 1, stewardship. Number 2, incarnation. Number 3, subordination. And lastly, sanctification. So number 1, stewardship. And this kind of falls into 2 different categories. Is number 1, ownership. Our bodies are not our own. No matter how much you think that your body is your own, or that you try to make it a cosmetic project or a self-expression platform, we at the end of the day belong to Christ. 1 Corinthians 6:19-20 says, "You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies." Romans 12:1 reminds us, "Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." 1 Corinthians 4:7 says, "What do you have that you did not receive? And if you did receive it, why do you boast as though you did not?" So stewardship means managing what belongs to another. It's maximizing usefulness and minimizing preventable damage. So let me give you a little story, a tale of 2 cars, so to speak. Let's say there's a working dad, and he has 2 boys that are the same age, and this dad is working really hard in his 9 to 5 to be able to get enough money to buy both of these kids a car. And finally, the time comes, he's made enough money to be able to buy these cars for both these kids. And child number 1, he gets the car. He never really changes the oil. He lets the trash pile up on the inside. He constantly ignores the check engine light. He drives it recklessly and doesn't wash it. And because of his actions, the car starts to break down. It's unreliable. And child number 1 is constantly asking for rides because his car simply is either broken or unreliable. And through his actions, he essentially says to the dad, "I don't value the hours you worked to give me this, and your sacrifice wasn't really worth my effort to maintain it." Right? And on the other hand, child number 2, he sees the car as a tool. He learns how to check and fix the tire pressure. He takes good care of it. He changes the oil on time, and he keeps the inside clean and washes it often. Well, what does these actions lead to? Well, the car actually lasts for several years. It's reliable, and it helps this child number 2, actually build a career and a family because he has a reliable means of transportation. So through his actions, he basically says, "I remember how hard you worked for this. I value your gift, Dad, and I'm going to maximize the use out of it by treating it well and taking care of it." So the point of this analogy is that when we take care of a gift, we aren't just fixing a machine, we are honoring the giver, right? Child number 1 basically says, "Hey, Dad, I don't value your hard work, so I'm going to treat this gift like trash," right? It's dishonoring the giver through the actions of not stewarding the gift. So if our bodies are a gift from God, then our fitness is the, so to speak, changing the oil or keeping the engine tuned in the car, right? It's using it and stewarding it well. We don't get fit to show off the car, right? We don't change the oil to show off the car. We get fit so that we can drive the car further to do the things that the owner, God, wants us to do. And at the end of the day, loving the giver means taking care of the gift. Let me say that again. Loving the giver means taking care of the gift. And that is especially true with our bodies as a gift from Christ. Number 2 is preventable neglect. I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier. And at the end of the day, we cannot avoid all sickness. We obviously can't control aging, no matter how hard we try to live forever. We cannot prevent all diseases, and we cannot avoid all injuries. These are inevitable. John 16:33 says, "In this world you will have troubles." Right? We are guaranteed that storms will come. Like the wind will blow, rain will come down. We will face trials of many kinds. However, there are some things that we can steward well, that we can actually kind of influence. At the end of the day, God has meticulous and providential sovereignty over everything, but through our actions we can reduce, ultimately, metabolic dysfunction, excess inflammation, sarcopenia, or severe lack of muscle, and lifestyle-related diseases and problems, right? So having an excess consumption of junk food, minimal or poor sleep, and lack of training on a consistent basis, well, these preventable things can lead to problems down the line, right? Like disease, heart attacks, strokes. So many of these things can basically be preventable if we steward the gift well, through exercise, through losing fat, through building muscle. Next up is the Incarnation. Out of all things, Christ came to embody a body. Like, that is amazing. Like, he could have came as some light or extraterrestrial being or some sort of weird shape or light or whatever, but he chose to come in human form, a body. And because of that, Christ chose to come as a human. He took on flesh, right? He had muscles, he had hormones, he had fatigue, he had hunger. He lived embodied obedience to the Father. And that shows that our physical bodies are important. They're not just trash cans, but they're also not idols. So there's kind of a spectrum. In 1st and 2nd Corinthians, you'll see Paul talking a lot about the body, right? 1 Corinthians 6:19. See, at the time, the people at the church of Corinth thought that the body was a trash can, right? So if like the spirit was going to live forever, then might as well trash the body now, right? But Paul reminds us that our bodies actually do matter. And then on the other end of the spectrum, especially through today's society and social media and influencers and the overvalue of just looks and aesthetics, we can kind of connote that the body is everything, right? Like, that is our identity, that is our everything. Whereas at the end of the day, we need to be able to kind of come to the middle of those two extremes and know that, number one, our bodies do matter, but number two, they are not our everything. And that leads to subordination. So fitness is not ultimate, right? Our six-pack does not make us more righteous. Muscle does not equal holiness. Leanness does not guarantee us our salvation. And our discipline is not justification. So we need to have a hyper awareness, a radical awareness of idols in our lives, or ways that our flesh is getting in the way of us seeing Jesus more clearly. So especially with our fitness, we need to be aware of idolization. Like I said, our modern culture idolizes, abs, performance, big muscles, or impressive lifts or muscles. And our fitness, looking not like the world, must reject this identity in physique or mirror-based confidence or comparison and envy culture, and know that like fitness is a tool, but knowing God and making him known are ultimate, right? Like, at the end of the day, once you do start, losing fat, building muscle, you will see results. And we need to be anchored, abiding daily in the Word, to know that our full value comes from the finished work on the cross, and not in whether or not we have big abs or big biceps or a big bench, right? So make sure that you're keeping the main thing, and not letting the lies of this world creep in and affect your identity or spark up some comparison or envy in your life. And lastly, we got stewardship, incarnation, subordination, and sanctification. So if you don't already know, sanctification is just the process of growing in holiness. It's becoming more like Jesus and maturing in our faith. And getting bigger muscles, less body fat, or a fit body in and of themselves isn't the main end goal, but they're a very helpful tool for training us in righteousness, right? Like I said, exercise trains our discipline, self-control, and allows us to practice saying no to the flesh, right? Our health through like losing body fat, having a healthy body composition, supports our joy and removes those biological barriers, supporting the way that God engineered and created our bodies. And lastly, our exercise increases our capacity and effectiveness at loving and serving others. We're able to serve others for not only longer, but more effectively for longer. And fitness becomes an area where pride is exposed, laziness is confronted, consistency is formed, and our identity is refined. I'll see so many people too, they'll start working out, they'll make fitness an idol. Their identity is in their six-pack or in their leanness, the amount of muscle they have, their waist size, and then maybe they get sick or maybe they get injured, and then all of those things start to kind of fade away, and then they have this huge identity crisis, right? Which kind of shows that it's very shaky ground if that's what we're putting our identity in, right? It just reminds us that putting our identity on the firm foundation, on the rock, will leave us, guaranteed to be able to survive and withstand those storms when they eventually and inevitably do come. So in the end, through the process of exercise, fitness, getting a healthy body composition, it can be a really helpful tool for helping us grow in holiness and mature in our faith. So I know that there is so much more to be said about this topic, and it's such a comprehensive thing, but I hope this gave you a good blueprint of why we as Christians should be fit in the first place. I think so many times if I went up to you and asked you in the gym right now, okay, why do you work out? I think a lot of times we would say, oh, I want, abs, or I want bigger muscles, or I want to be healthy. Okay, but like why? Why do you want those things? And I hope that this gave you some insight of not only increasing the importance of exercise and our agency in doing these things now in the current season that we're in, but also highlighted some maybe more deeper whys. And that's exactly why I put together an entire worksheet. And you can just find this in the link in the description of this video. This entire worksheet will kind of go through several of these things that I went through in this video, but also more importantly, it'll give you some good questions to ask yourself and even some prayer prompts to think about as you craft your why for getting fit, right? Okay, like why, like the reward, why are you doing these things such that you can have that six-pack, right? In and of itself, having a six-pack is not necessarily or inherently sinful, but the motive could be, right? God cares a lot more about our hearts rather than the decisions themselves. So if you kind of don't know why you should be fit or even how to get fit in general, I'm looking for 6 more Christian men who want to steward the bodies well and make fitness a thing such that Christ is at the center of it all, right? They're stewarding their bodies well for their love, their mind, and for their will. And they don't just want to get fit for vanity's sake or for comparison's sake, but they ultimately want to lead their families and serve the other people around them. Well, if that's you, go ahead and comment or email me, and that'll be in the description as well, Steward, and we'll go ahead and give you some more details. Other than that, thank you so much for watching this video. If you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so I'll catch you in the next one. And if you have any thoughts about this video or even suggestions for future videos or even struggles that you're going through right now, go ahead and comment below. I'll respond to every single comment on this video. And other than that, have a blessed rest of your day and a great week, and I'll catch you in the next video.